Alright guys, so I thought I'd make a quick video showing the various different options of the PixelModeller AI add-on, which is available on the Blender market. So firstly, let's have a look at how we install it. So we're going to Edit, into Preferences, and under the Add-ons tab, just click at the top and choose Install from Disk. Then select the zip file you've downloaded and just click Install. Once you've done that, it's going to appear in your options here. So we've got PixelModeller AI, and then you've got three file locations that you need set up. The first one is the AI module path. So this is where, once you click this button here, it's going to download the AI modules. And the modules it's going to use are Torch, CV2, and Pillow. All you need to do is make sure that the folder you specify here has got read-write privileges, and the same goes for the image path as well. The AI model path, that can be read-only. It doesn't write to that one at all. The next one, AI model path, this is where you download your AI model to, so the weights for the model, and you've got various different options. Any of these models here are compatible, and there's on the documentation page, you can find the links that will download these for you. If you're going to use just one, I'd recommend the Depth Anything V2 with the L on the end. The L stands for large, and that will generally give you better results. The next best one is the S, so the Depth Anything V2 small. The other two I've put in just for completeness because I know quite a few people like these models, but I do find that this one is by far, it gives much better superior results. So you specify the place, you download it, put the model in there, and that's all you need to do with that one. The image path, this is just where the add-on saves the images to that get generated when you generate the model. So once you've specified your path, all you do is click on Install or Update the AI modules. Now, I'd recommend you choose an empty folder. Rather than using a path that's already got these AI modules in it, if another add-on requires specific versions of those modules, then you don't necessarily want to replace them. Otherwise, your other add-on might stop working. So I'd recommend to use a different one and uninstall, or disable rather, any other add-ons you've got in here that use those modules. So any other AI-based add-ons or any add-ons that use CV2, Torch, or Pillow. That'll just make sure you don't get any conflicts. If you've already downloaded them to this folder, you can choose to replace the existing ones, or it will just update them as necessary. So all you do, once you've specified those, you click on Install the modules, and it's going to take a while depending on your internet connection because it's 1.4 gigabytes of files. On my machine, it takes about 20 seconds because I've got quite a fast internet. But if you've got slow internet, it might take a while. And while it's downloading, Blender will freeze, so don't panic if that happens. You can also watch the progress of the downloads in the Blender terminal as well. And once you've downloaded them, all you've got to do is close down Blender, reopen it, and then it's going to work. So as soon as you've got it installed, I'd recommend to have a layout like this where you've got three image editors at the bottom. One's going to be for the depth map, one's going to be for the bump map, and one's going to be for the color map. We've got the option to generate in the tab on the side here, and we've got the different places we can get those images from. We can either use the clipboard for the color map, depth map, and the 3D bump map. So we've got the same options in all of them. We've got a few extra ones in the bump map. We can choose a file. So if you've already got a file on disk, you can choose a file instead of a clipboard. Image, this is going to let you choose an image from Blender, so an image that you've already brought in to Blender. Or blank canvas is going to allow you to draw the image or the depth map. So I'm going to use clipboard for starters. And I want to make sure as well I've got Use AI turned on. So if you don't want to use AI, let's say for example you've already got a depth map on disk, you can just choose the file and just specify the existing depth map that you want to use. You can still use the Use AI with a color map, and it will convert that into a depth map for you. As I mentioned before, the Depth Anything V2 large I find is the best one, and the size allows you to get more detail in the depth map. But be careful with these because it can use quite a bit of memory and take quite a long time. The 512 is going to use around about 2 gigabytes and take around about 1 or 2 seconds. The 1024 takes around about 8 seconds and can use up to 8 gigabytes. And the 1600, this can take around about anything from 40 seconds to 2 minutes and it's going to use between 8 and 16 or even more, maybe even as much as 20 gigabytes. So it does take a while, but generally I find 512 is more than sufficient to get a decent result. Let's try the tiger for starters. So we'll right click on it and we'll choose copy the image, not the link, make sure it copy the image. Or if you're on Windows, you can just Windows Shift S and then you can box select an image that you want to bring in. But I'm just going to copy the image. And then we'll go back to Blender and we're going to click on generate. So click on generate. I need to make sure I change this to clipboard. AI is on, generate that, and it's going to take that image from the clipboard and then it's going to generate the depth map in a few seconds, and then the rest of the time is going to be spent generating the model. So if we look down here, you can see it's generated for us a depth map. It's saved the clipboard image to the disk, and it's also brought the textures in, but also it's set up the materials for us as well. What we can do then is start looking at all the different options we've got in the controls. So once you've generated it, you've basically got these controls that will pop up. So if you've got nothing selected, you won't see those options. If you've got a PixelModeller AI model already generated, select it, you're going to get these different options. I'll just minimize this by pressing A. And then initially, let's look at the options we've got. So the first one is the quality. Now it's going to choose a low quality automatically for you to make sure you've got fast interaction with the slider. So if I modify this now, you see it's quite fast. The scale usually needs tweaking. So just scale that to what looks correct. So around about there, I think looks pretty good. Previous 3D print is going to let you see how it's going to look when you print it off as a 3D model. So click on that and you'll see the color now is dependent on the quality. So the quality is quite low. So because it's using Vertex colors, there's not enough geometry to give us high resolution in the color. If I turn the quality up, you'll see that starts getting much higher resolution in the Vertex colors. So I'll just turn it back down to keep it quite fast. And incidentally, the 3D print option also disables smoothing, because obviously when you do a 3D print, it's not going to have any sort of software-based smoothing. Alright, so I'll turn off the 3D print preview, and now we can see the result of the texture, which is driven by UVs instead. So next, let's move on to the cleanup options. So in this case, we don't have any alpha, it's just a normal image. If there was transparency, then it will delete the model where the image is transparent. And you can either tell it to use the alpha source as the color map, or you can use the depth map. So if I was to, let's say, come into this image here, and I'll just choose the erase. This is going to erase the image, and I'm doing it on the color map. And you'll see that's deleted it on there. But we don't need to do that, so I'll just undo that. And I can use instead the remove background. So if I just hold down shift and I'll slide this, you'll see it's going to delete that background for us. And we've got a little bit of color bleed on the side. So I can use the shrink silhouette. So if I put this down to something like 2, it's going to get rid of that color bleed from the grass in the background. We've also got remove foreground. So this is if you've got things in the image that are further forward than the object you want to actually pull from the image. So if I remove the foreground, I put it below 1. So take it below 1, you'll see it starts deleting the model, and it will actually delete it. So you're going to get a whole, it's going to absolutely remove anything that you don't want. So I'll just put that back up to something high, like 10. The smallest island, this is if you've got little tiny bits of model that you don't want. You can just turn this up and it will remove any small islands that have got a face area below this. So I don't need that here because there are no little bits of model, it's all one entire piece. And by the way, these are all 3D printable because they're solid objects. Okay, so next up, we've got the perspective fix. This is if you've taken the picture not dead on, so you're going to have a little bit of slant in your image. You can use this to fix that. You can use it on the vertical and also on the horizontal. And then for both of these, you've got the origin. So the origin is the point at which it's going to pivot. So if I go into side view, and then let's give this some twist. You can see it's twisting in the middle of the model. So this is the origin, 0.5. If I put it to 1, it's going to be at the top of the image. And now if I twist it, you'll see it's pivoting from the top. And if I put it to 0, it's going to be the bottom of the image. And then you can see it's pivoting from the bottom. So that's handy if you've got things like a gun, or you want to make a, I don't know, something like a snooker cue or something like that. And next up, we've got the shape. So the shape is, this allows you to modify the overall shape of the object. So let's say I don't want it to be flat on the back. I want it to be a symmetrical object. So what I could do, I can make this a negative number. And you see that's going to make it into a two-sided object, perfect for things like guns or swords or any sort of weapon or tools, or hammers and things like that. For this one, you can also put it in the positive direction, and that's going to be better for things like a mask. And then you can cut out the eyes and things like that. We can thicken that out a bit as well, and it's still going to be concave on the back. Okay, so put it back to 0, and I'll turn thickness off. Next up, we've got the Enhance Features option. So this is good for caricatures, or just if your depth map doesn't have sufficient detail, you can use this to enhance the details. And what it does, it brings the high point forward, and then it will push any point backwards that is below the bias. So the bias is 1, just like with the perspective, where we could have set the origin here. This is basically the origin for that. So anything below 1 at the moment is going to get pushed back, so we're only getting the nose staying forward. But if I change this bias down, then you can imagine a sort of a plane that's sliding back until we get all the way down to 0, and then it's going to push everything forward. And we can control that and then get rid of the flat part just by turning down the effect either here, or we can change it to squash instead. And that will push anything forward of that bias point forward. Put that to 1, and then we'll put that back to exaggerate. And you can see you can get quite a bit of control over the shape of the object. Turn that off. Next up, we've got slide. So you'll see on the side, we've got parts of the model that weren't visible to the camera, so that front texture around the border is just stretching backwards. We could, of course, get rid of it by sliding that up, but what we can also do is slide the entire thing back until we've got rid of most of that stretching on the side. And then we can bring back the bits we've lost using the limits here. So we can set a minimum height. So if I set this to 0.001, you see it's going to bring it all back. And then we don't want this really sharp. This is the bit it's brought back. We want to smooth that off a little bit. We can then use the fall off. So you can see we can just bring it back and add a little bit of smoothness with the fall off. And then we've got the clip. So this is going to clip the front. Instead of deleting it, so we don't get a hole, it's going to just flatten it down. And then we can use the fall off again to smooth that out. So again, giving you quite a bit of control over the shape there as well. So I'll turn that back to 0. Turn the fall off to 0 as well. Okay, next up, we've got the smoothing. So under smoothing, by default, it's going to be disabled just to keep it nice and fast. And at this point, if I turn the smoothing on, we just come and look at the side here, for example, you can see it's very jagged where we've got the individual faces. And what we can do is enable smoothing by turning the disable all option off, and it's going to rebuild it for us, and it's going to smooth out the silhouette, the 2D silhouette. And this is controlled here. So this is the amount, it's going to smooth that silhouette. And then we can correct any loss of volume in the 2D area by adjusting the area correction. So if I turn this up, it's going to bring it back. So if I disable it, you'll see we're getting pretty much the same volume of the 2D mesh. Okay, so I'll just put that down to something like 22, so don't over smooth it. Next up, we've got the 3D smooth. As you probably can guess, this is going to smooth it on the X, Y, and Z. So it's going to give us a result like that. And this is going to be actually, the higher you set these values, the slower it's going to be. So if I put this back down to something like 1, don't really necessarily need to use that unless you want to get rid of, change the shape quite a bit. The features, it's similar to 3D smooth. You see we're retaining the overall shape, we're just smoothing the features on the model itself. So that's handy if you've got any artifacts in there, like maybe here, you can see it's quite jagged. We could reduce those by smoothing the features a little bit as well. Now at this point, what I'd generally do before tweaking all these is just go into the main controls and choose a quality that's more similar to what I actually want to use in my finished product. And that's because the smoothing controls will have a different effect based on the amount of geometry. You can see we're getting a lot of detail now, and a lot of this detail is actually coming from the bump underneath. So let me just temporarily disable that. I'll set this to 0. So we're only getting the actual effect of the depth map. Okay, so next up we've got side smooth. So this is on the side of the model. We can actually smooth that out. If we put it to 0, it's not going to be smooth at all. Probably easier to see if we go into wireframe. You see it's quite a harsh edge on the side there. If I just turn this up to maybe 200, you'll see it smoothed it right out. And this is quite good as well for getting rid of any texture stretching. So if we go across now, we can see the texture is actually, it's going around the side a lot more than it was before. Whereas if I set this to something like 10, there's a larger area on the side, which is just stretched pixels. So let's set this back to 250. And we can then use the fall off to extend that side smoothness out into the front and the back of the model. The volume correction is just for the side smooth, and it's similar to area correction, but it's a 3-dimensional. So if you turn that up, it's going to bulge out just the sides of the object. So the next options we've got are the options for beveling and sharpening. So we can set the number of segments on the side here, and we can also sharpen it back up to create a bevel on the front or the back. And these work in conjunction with the side smooth. So we can control the smoothness with this one, and then we can sharpen it back up with these ones. And it's not really something I want to do on an organic model like this. I'd prefer this to be sort of stretching around the sides. But if we go into a new file, and we'll just change this from clipboard to blank canvas so we can actually paint it. I'll do the same for bump as well. I'll set the resolution. I'll click on generate. That's created me 3 new maps. And we can't see anything at the moment because if you remember, the cleanup is using the alpha source to delete the mesh wherever the color map, which is this one, is transparent. And it's completely transparent, so we can't see anything at all. So let's paint something. Firstly, I'm going to just set a depth. So let's go on to this one. And we'll choose a color. Maybe just a grey. And I'll just choose the fill brush and fill that in. So that's the depth of the model. And then as soon as we start painting on here, it's going to start appearing in the viewport over there. So let's choose a different brush. We'll go with the paint hard. And also, I want to make sure under the fall off, I set this to constant so that the change in transparency is immediate. Otherwise, we'll get a lot of black bleeding through into the sides of the model. And I also want to go into the advanced options in here and just turn off anti-aliasing. Again, just so we get an immediate transition from transparent to non-transparent. And then we can start painting a color. So let's just change this to something like, I don't know, orange. And I can start painting on here. And we're going to see that appear in the viewport. And if I turn on material preview, it's going to be orange. And we are still getting a little bit of black showing through at the sides here. And we can get rid of that in a couple of ways. We can either turn up the alpha threshold. So if we turn that up, you'll see that's going to start deleting that black that's bleeding through. So I'll just turn that down a little bit. Or an alternative way to do it would be to use the shrink silhouette, and that's going to do the same thing. All right, so I'll set the scale. Maybe about there. And then we can start looking at what these other smoothing tools do that we were just talking about. So back into smoothing. And then we can control the smoothness of the 2D silhouette using this one. And then bring them back some of that volume. And then we can also turn on the side smoothing. So turn it up a little bit. You see we're getting this sort of result. But we're going to start seeing In fact, let's go into a matte cap. I just use something shiny so we can actually see the problems. Here we go. So you can see here, we've actually got a little bit of shading artifacts. Well, not artifacts, but you can just see the geometry is a little bit wobbly because of the transition between the original mesh and those quads that we've rebuilt. So this is where we can use the bevel segments to push this back out off of the curved area onto the front. So let's turn up the bevel segment. You see as I turn that up, it's pushing that around to the front, and now we're not going to see any artifacts at all on the sides of the mesh. But we can control the sharpness of this using the sharpen front and back. We can do them individually, so if I turn this up a little bit, you can see that's going to sharpen that out. And we can do the same on the back as well. Or we can control them both at once by just selecting one, dragging down, and then we can drag left and right to control that fall off. And then we can continue tweaking the different smoothing options in combination with the sharpen and segments to get the exact look that we want. And if you do see any wobbly artifacts or reflections and things, it's just because of the transition between the front and the back. So use the segments to push that rebuilt geometry back towards the front, and that should resolve that. Or alternatively, you can use the remesh options below, which we'll come to in a second. Let's move on to the bump. So the bump happens after the smoothing. So this smoothing options we've got here, these are just for the smoothing of the depth map. So they're not going to affect the actual bump itself. So let's go into this view. You can see at the moment, I've got bump turned off. But if I turn this up, so you don't want it too high, maybe 0.005, something like that. And that's immediately going to add all that fine detail on from the bump map, which is currently the color map. So it's using the color map just like a bump map would, but it's pushing the actual geometry out more like a displacement map. And we can control whether or not we want the bump to be pushing the geometry out based on the normal, or we can just push it straight forward. So pushing it straight forward means you're not going to get any overlapping geometry. Whereas if you use a 3D bump, it's possible to get overlapping geometry. But in some scenarios, it's a better result. And we can always get rid of that overlapping geometry using the remesh tools, which I'll come to in a second. So just looking more at the bump, if you want to smooth it, we can use but the bump's got its own smooth. So if I turn this up to 50, for example, it's going to smooth out that result. I'll usually put it at something like 2, just to make sure there's no jagged bits of geometry where there's insufficient geometry underneath to support the bump on the texture. So 2 is a pretty good result. Now, we've also got the ability to turn off the bump on the back. So if we're not using a symmetrical object, maybe we're doing a 3D print and it's a keyring or something like that, you might want to turn the bump off on the back so that the back is nice and smooth. Or if you're going to leave it on, you've also got the ability to invert it. So it's going to send the bump the opposite way. Now you'll notice when I do that, we do start getting artifacts at the sides there. And that's because the bump is being pushed through the bump on the front. So to avoid this, what we can do, we've got the ability to shrink the bump map. So let's just turn the fall off for now. And I'll shrink it by, let's say, 100 faces. And that's going to bring that in now. So it's shrunk it in from the outside of the geometry. And then you can use the fall off to sort of make it a more subtle transition. So if I put this to 50, instead of being harsh, it's going to be a nice subtle transition. Now, I've gone way too far there just for demonstration purposes, but just to get rid of that issue on the side there, I'll probably set it to something like maybe 50, and maybe 10. It all depends on how much geometry you've got. So it depends on the quality you've got set here. The higher the quality, the more faces there are going to be. So the higher the shrink you're probably going to need. So maybe go with 5. Give it a fall off of 10. You can see now we've got rid of all those artifacts on the side. And then of course we've just got the standard transform options. We can move the bump map left and right, up and down. We can rotate it, and we can also scale it as well on both axes. With this one, of course, I want to keep it aligned with the color map because they're both using the same map. Next up, we'll look at the remesh. Now this is most useful if you have pushed some of the bump options to extremes. So let's just do that. maybe put this to 0.1. We're going to start seeing overlapping geometry all over the place. And of course, this is not going to be 3D printable. So to fix this, we'll come down to the remesh and we'll turn this on. And also, by the way, let's just go to material preview. When I do this, we're not going to lose any of that color data or UV data. So it's going to take a little while depending on how high you've got your quality. And you see it's maintained all that color detail, but it's got rid of any overlapping geometry. So if we go into wireframe, you can see we've no longer got overlapping geometry. It all sort of morphs into each other. And we've got no interior faces either. For the tools we've got in here, we can push the quality higher or lower. So if I want this to be smoothed out, I could put this down to maybe 20 or something like that. We're getting far less geometry, but it's still not overlapping. We're still getting no, not really going to get any issues with 3D printing. Or we can also take it a little bit higher. So if I go to 150, this is going to give us more geometry than the original mesh, which will help maintain really fine detail. You see, we're still not getting any overlapping geometry. We might see a few little black areas like this if we're using the UV map. But if we go into Vertex colors for your 3D printing, let's just turn this on. You can see we're not getting those black areas anymore. And the remesh has also got its own smoothing options so that you can smooth it out after it's been remeshed as well. We've also got the ability to use adaptivity. So adaptivity is going to use large faces where it can and small faces where it's necessary to keep the curvature. Now, generally, I wouldn't use this. I've only put it in as an option if you're creating models for sort of distant models like trees and things like that you're going to be scattering around. But for close-up objects, this will probably create sort of artifacts on the mesh. It's much better instead to not use adaptivity here and then use the decimate modifier after you've converted this to a mesh. I wouldn't put it while it's still calculating all this. Wait till you've converted it to a mesh and then use the decimate modifier afterwards if you want to reduce the face count. And we've also got a shrink wrap. So shrink wrap, let's just turn the bump and the quality down a bit temporarily. Let's put this down to 30, just for speed. The shrink wrap is going to make the remesh model conform to the original mesh so that you can get that smooth surface back. So put this to 0 and turn that smoothing off. You can see we can actually see the voxels in the remesh. So this is much better than using smoothing, the shrink wrap, because this is going to actually smooth it to the shape of the original object. Whereas if we do this smoothing here, put this to 50 for example, it will get rid of those, but you are going to start losing detail, which would be kept if you use shrink wrap instead. But you're sometimes going to want to use a combination of the two. Smallest island is going to do the same as the one in the cleanup options further up, but it's going to do it after remeshing, just in case the remesher does create any small little islands of geometry, which would mess up 3D printing. So that's going to get rid of those for you. Smoothing, obviously, we've already looked at. And then finally, we've got the color. So just like we could with the bump map, we can move the color, rotate it and scale it. And we can also opt to not use the image on the back. We can use a color instead. So if I don't tick this, I'll just turn off remesh as well to make it a bit faster. You can see we've now got a color on the back instead of the image. And if it's stretching around the front because of the smoothing options, then we can use the sharpen back to force that backwards to make sure it stays where it's supposed to be. Just don't push it too far, otherwise you're going to start getting overlapping geometry like this, unless you want to use a bit of 3D smoothing to get rid of that. Or alternatively, we can just reduce that sharpness a little bit on the back. And then when you're finished, you can just put the quality back to whatever you wanted. So I think 60 was pretty good. And then we've got a decent result. So I'll just quickly modify the shape a little bit so we've got more of that texture stretching on the sides, and I'll show you how we can get rid of that after we've converted it to a standard mesh using either vertex painting or texture painting. So let's convert this to a mesh. Right click, convert to mesh. Go into the material, you'll see it's created two materials for us, And the one that if we had 3D printing preview ticked, then we would get a different material. It would use the Vertex colors. But because we didn't have it ticked, it's created a material that uses the image texture as the base color. So let me just show you that. And you can see the material that's been assigned is using the image texture rather than the Vertex color. So let's say I want to start modifying the texture. What I'd need to do to get rid of this stretching is generate some new UVs. Well, there's two ways we can do it actually. Let's firstly look at how we can do it with Vertex Paint. So we've got all of in here, we've got the color attribute created for us automatically. If we now go into Vertex Paint, and we'll just change it over here to show us the attribute, because at the moment we're using the color map. And then we'll click on the attribute, on the color map here in the color attribute, so that one's selected. You can see we've got the tiger in there, and we can start painting over, we can start using all the brushes we've got. For example, I might want to blur the sides here if I've got a little bit of texture stretching. Or what I can also do is actually paint bits of this tiger, the good stuff, onto the side if I want to. And we can do that in a number of ways. So let's go into the tools. I want to set a texture now. So I'll go down to texture settings. I'll just create a new one. And I'll click on this little icon here. It's going to open up the texture panel for us. And then we can choose an image. So I want to use that same tiger texture. So I need to click on open. And then I'm going to go to the location where PixelModeller images are saved. We'll choose this one. And now we can start using this texture to paint on there. So I'm going to change this to be a stencil. And then I can shift, right click and drag to scale it up just to get the bit of the image that I want to be used for the part of the model it's over. I can just paint on there. Got to make sure as well that instead of blur brush, I choose one of these. So go paint soft. And just make sure I set this to white so it works fully. And we can also modify the fall off and things to make sure we get a nice result. And again, I'm going to have to go back in here, just choose that texture again because I'm on a different brush now. Change it to stencil. And just do that again. If you just right click and drag, it positions it. Shift, right click and drag, it scales it. Control right click and drag, and it's going to rotate it. Let's get it where I want it. And we can just paint on there, making sure that this is set to white. And then that's going to paint that onto the side there. I won't do the entire mesh, but just to give you the idea of how it works. Like that. So there's the idea. And we can also do the same thing instead with so this is good for if you're doing a 3D print, you can do it like this. But we can also do it by modifying the actual texture itself. So let's come back into object mode. And we'll go into material preview this time. So we're using the image texture again. And this time what I want to do is I want to transfer this color. I can't paint on the side here because if we look at the UV map, let's just open up a UV editor. And I want to use this image here. So image to 3D col. And we'll go into edit mode. Click on the UV sync selection button so we can see the UVs underneath. And at the moment, the faces on the side of the object are sharing the same UV space as the border of the front of the object. So what we need to do is give those side faces their own unique space in the UV window. And to achieve that, we need to create a second UV map. So let's just delete this one we don't need. And then I'll create a new one. And we'll call it baked. Okay. And what I'm going to do is unwrap it. So I'll select everything by pressing A, U, and I'll just choose something like Smart UV Project or any of these that you want. I've got a full course on this, by the way. It's free as well. If you want to check on my YouTube homepage, there's an 18-hour course and it covers all of these options in depth. But for now, I'm just going to go with the Smart UV Project and I'll just click Unwrap. And then we'll come into the Cycles options. So make sure you're in Cycles. And I'm just going to turn down the samples. We don't need this very high. I'll just put this to something like 16. And then we'll come down to the bake options. And I need to create a texture to basically transfer this image into the new UVs. So Shift A, image texture, and I'm going to create new. Let's call it Baked Tiger. I'll make it 4K. I don't really need alpha, so I'll get rid of that. And I don't want it to be 32-bit, and I'll just click New Image. And I want to make sure this is using the new UVs that we've created over here as well, so baked. So I'll do Shift A, UV map. I'll change this to be baked, and I'll plug this in here. And now back in the cycles options, back down to bake. I want to say bake from, or the bake type rather, to be diffuse. I just want the diffuse color. And I only want the color. I don't want direct or indirect lighting. So turn those off. Make sure this is selected, the new image, and I'll just click bake. And if we actually just, let's change this to be baked tiger. Let's come out of edit mode. And now click bake. And it hasn't worked because we've got no active image. I'm not sure actually why that is. Bake from diffuse, so this is diffuse. That's definitely active. Let's just try that again. Not sure why that didn't work. Try again. No. Why is that? Let's just try plugging this directly into the base color. Oh, that's very odd. Oh no, what? Hang on. Oh, I'm using the wrong UVs. I've deleted the UVs on this. Let's just change this to UV, what was it? UV map. UV map. There we go. There we go. Okay. Bit confused there. Let's plug that back in there. Make sure this one's selected again. The reason, what happened there, by the way, was I deleted the UVs that this image was using, so they weren't getting transferred across. But now we've changed this to the UV map. It's going to be fine. So back into cycles. Make sure we choose bake. And there we go. So now we've got the new texture in here, but the difference is the faces on the side of the object have now got their own unique space on the UV grid. So if we go into texture paint mode instead of vertex paint mode, and then I can use all of these options in here. Let's just change this to paint soft. We can start painting over the original. We need to plug this one in to see it. There you go. So now we've plugged this new one into the base color. We can now see the effects of painting on there. So let me just undo that quickly. So now you'll see when I start painting over there, I can paint onto it. But we've also got the ability, we've got an additional tool in here in texture paint. We've got the clone tool. So if I choose this, I can choose a different area of the mesh. So maybe here. So control and left click. It's going to put the 3D cursor there. And then I can actually transfer that onto the side of the model. And it's useful for areas like this as well. We can start transferring different parts of the correct stuff onto the bits that are stretched out. Or alternatively, we can come into what like we did before. We can come down to texture mask. So let's just choose a different brush. We'll go with the paint soft. We'll use that texture mask we used before. Make sure we set this to stencil. Move that in place. And then we can start painting on like that. It's probably a bit quicker to do it this way. Like so. Again, I'm not going to do the entire thing, but just to show you how it's done. And now we've got these this result on the side. Let's just maybe get the main here. Put this over the side, etc. So you can draw all the way around your object. Let's just get rid of that. So we get rid of the stretching that way as well. Now, one last thing you might want to do is actually make this into a geometry that's suitable for a game engine. Well, I'll tell you what, I'll do this in a separate video because this one's gone on a little while. I'll show you this in the next video. Basically, we're going to make this into a low poly object and transfer the high details onto that low poly object, so we can use it in, like on a game on your phone or something like that. So stick around for the next video. Make sure you subscribe if you want to catch those. And thanks for watching. I'll catch you in the next one.